What if the person you promised to love, honor, and cherish for the rest of your life was the very same person who would lead you to a horrifying, watery grave? What if your love story was nothing more than a prelude to a $3 billion lie? Tonight, we delve into a tale of greed, betrayal, and the chilling darkness that can lurk behind a perfect smile. But before we descend into this swamp of secrets, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you never miss another story of the shadows. Now, let the darkness unfold. The screen fades to black, and then the first chapter begins. The scent of orchids and old money permeated the air of the Beaumont estate, a sprawling mansion of white columns and manicured lawns that seemed to stretch into the very heart of the Louisiana bayou. From the outside, it was a picture of Southern perfection, a testament to generational wealth and pristine reputations. Inside, however, the air was thick with a different kind of perfume, the cloying sweetness of secrets and the subtle metallic tang of deceit. At the center of this gilded cage was Eleanor Beaumont, a woman whose beauty was as legendary as her family's fortune. With eyes the color of a summer sky and hair like spun gold, she was the epitome of grace and elegance. But beneath the polished veneer of the perfect wife and philanthropist, there was a profound and aching loneliness. She moved through the grand halls of her home like a ghost, her laughter a little too bright, her smiles a little too practiced. She was a bird with gilded wings, trapped in a cage of her own making, a cage she had willingly walked into for love. Her husband, Julian Beaumont, was a man of stark and captivating contrasts. He was devastatingly handsome, with a chiseled jaw, piercing dark eyes, and a charm that could disarm even the most hardened cynic. He was the architect of their perfect life, a man who had taken his wife's family fortune and multiplied it tenfold through a series of audacious and often ruthless business deals. He was a pillar of the community, his name whispered with a mixture of awe and envy in the exclusive country clubs and smoke-filled boardrooms of New Orleans. But behind the charismatic facade, Julian was a man hollowed out by an insatiable hunger, a relentless ambition that knew no bounds and recognized no morality. Their love story had been the stuff of fairy tales, or so the society pages had breathlessly reported. The dashing, self-made man who had swept the beautiful heiress off her feet. Their wedding had been a lavish affair, a spectacle of champagne fountains and diamond-studded everything. But as the years had passed, the fairy tale had begun to curdle, the love story slowly and insidiously rewritten into a narrative of control and quiet desperation. Julian's love was a possessive, suffocating thing. He showered Eleanor with extravagant gifts, a rare vintage car one day, a priceless piece of art the next, but each gift was another bar on her cage. He controlled every aspect of her life, from the charities she supported to the friends she was allowed to keep. He monitored her phone calls, scrutinized her emails, and his jealousy was a constant, simmering presence in their opulent home. He loved her, he told her, more than life itself. And in a twisted, terrifying way, he believed it. She was his most prized possession, the ultimate symbol of his success. Eleanor, in her naivete and her desperate desire to be loved, had initially mistaken his possessiveness for passion, his control for concern. But as the years wore on, the illusion had begun to crack. She saw the cold calculation in his eyes when he looked at her, the flicker of something predatory that he couldn't quite conceal. She felt the invisible walls he had built around her, the suffocating weight of his expectations. She was a beautiful, tragic queen in a kingdom of one, with her husband as her adoring and terrifying king. And then there was Amelia. Amelia Dubois was everything Eleanor was not. She was a creature of the city, a whirlwind of ambition and raw, unapologetic sexuality. A rising star in Julian's company, she was sharp, witty, and possessed a ruthless streak that mirrored his own. With fiery red hair, a constellation of freckles across her nose, and a laugh that was loud and uninhibited, she was a force of nature. She saw the world not as a place of beauty and grace, but as a battlefield where only the strong and the cunning survived. And she saw in Julian Beaumont a fellow warrior, a man who, like her, was not afraid to take what he wanted. Their affair had started as a spark of illicit attraction in a late-night board meeting, a shared glance across a polished mahogany table that held more promise and danger than any business deal. It had quickly escalated into a raging inferno, a secret, passionate world they had carved out for themselves in the anonymous luxury of high-end hotel rooms and secluded restaurants. With Amelia, Julian felt a sense of freedom he had never known with Eleanor. Amelia didn't want to be cherished. She wanted to be challenged. She didn't want to be protected. She wanted to conquer the world alongside him. She saw the darkness in him, the ruthless ambition that he so carefully concealed from the world, and she wasn't afraid of it. She reveled in it. The affair was a dangerous game, but the thrill of it was intoxicating. It was a tightrope walk over a chasm of ruin, and with each passing day, Julian found himself more and more addicted to the adrenaline. But the game was becoming increasingly complicated. His life was a carefully constructed house of cards, and the affair was a gust of wind that threatened to bring it all crashing down. He had his reputation to consider, the empire he had built, and he had Eleanor. The thought of divorcing her was out of the question. A messy, public divorce would be a scandal of epic proportions. It would tarnish his carefully crafted image, and more importantly, it would mean a division of assets. Eleanor, with her family's name and her own considerable intelligence, would not go quietly. She would fight him, and she would likely win. He would lose a significant portion of his wealth, the very foundation of his power. No, divorce was not an option. It was during a late-night conversation with Amelia, their bodies entwined in the silken sheets of a hotel room overlooking the glittering cityscape of New Orleans, that the seed of a truly monstrous idea was planted. They were talking about their future, a future that seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly far away. "I can't keep living like this, Julian," Amelia had whispered, her voice a seductive purr against his ear. "Sneaking around, hiding in the shadows. I want to be with you. I want the world to know that you're mine." "I know, my love," Julian had replied, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "But it's complicated, Eleanor." Amelia had propped herself up on one elbow, her green eyes flashing in the dim light. "Complicated? Or are you just a coward? Are you really going to let her stand in our way?" The word coward had stung Julian's pride. He was not a coward. He was a king, a conqueror. He did not let obstacles stand in his way. He obliterated them. "What do you suggest I do, Amelia?" he had asked, a dangerous edge to his voice. "Should I just cast her aside? Let the vultures in the media pick apart our lives? Let her lawyers strip me of everything I've worked for?" Amelia had traced a long, red nail down his chest, her touch both a caress and a challenge. "There are other ways," she had said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Cleaner ways. Ways that would solve all of our problems." The implication had hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. It was a thought so dark, so audacious, that it had taken Julian's breath away. But as he looked into Amelia's eyes, he saw no fear, no hesitation, only a reflection of his own ruthless ambition. In the weeks that followed, the monstrous idea began to take root in Julian's mind. It was a weed, twisting and turning, its tendrils wrapping around his thoughts until it had consumed him completely. He began to look at Eleanor differently, not as his wife, but as an obstacle, a problem that needed to be solved. He started to meticulously plan, his sharp, analytical mind, the same mind that had built a business empire, now focused on a far more sinister enterprise, the perfect murder. His first step was to increase Eleanor's life insurance policy. He did it under the guise of responsible financial planning, a loving husband ensuring his wife's future was secure. He met with their family lawyer, a man who had known Eleanor since she was a child, and who had always been a little too fond of her. Julian played the part of the devoted husband to perfection, his voice laced with concern as he discussed the uncertainties of life, the need to be prepared for any eventuality. "I just want to make sure she's taken care of, Richard," Julian had said, his expression a mask of sincere devotion. "If anything were to ever happen to me, or to her, I couldn't bear the thought of her struggling." The lawyer, a portly man with a kind face and a trusting nature, had been completely taken in. He had praised Julian for his foresight, his unwavering dedication to his wife. The new policy was for a staggering $3 billion, a sum so vast it was almost incomprehensible. The premiums were exorbitant, but Julian paid them without a second thought. It was an investment, he told himself, in his future, a future with Amelia. His next step was to create a narrative, a story that would explain Eleanor's disappearance. He began to subtly hint to their friends and family that Eleanor was not well. He would mention her moods, her bouts of melancholy. He would cancel social engagements at the last minute, claiming that Eleanor was feeling overwhelmed. He would confide in their closest friends, his voice heavy with a husband's worry, that Eleanor was becoming increasingly withdrawn, that she had started talking about getting away from it all. He was a master manipulator, and he played his part with chilling precision. He would come home from a tryst with Amelia, his body still warm from her embrace, and immediately transform into the concerned, doting husband. He would find Eleanor in the library, her favorite room in the house, a sanctuary of books and quiet contemplation, and he would feign a look of deep concern. "Are you all right, my love?" he would ask, his voice a soft, gentle caress. "You seem so distant lately." Eleanor, who had been feeling increasingly isolated and unhappy, would simply nod, her eyes filled with a sadness that Julian had so skillfully manufactured. "I'm just tired, Julian," she would say. "Just a little tired." He was poisoning her life drop by insidious drop, and she didn't even realize it. He was isolating her, making her a stranger in her own home, in her own life. He was setting the stage for her final, tragic act. The perfect location for this final act was a place he knew well, a place that held a dark and primal beauty, the crocodile-infested swamps of the bayou. He owned a vast tract of land there, a remote and inaccessible wilderness that he had purchased years ago as a nature preserve. It was a place where a person could disappear without a trace, a place where the ancient reptilian predators were the undisputed kings. He began to plan a trip, a romantic getaway for just the two of them. He told Eleanor it was a chance for them to reconnect, to escape the pressures of their lives and rediscover the love they had once shared. He spoke of moonlit boat rides through the cypress trees, of quiet evenings spent listening to the symphony of the swamp. Eleanor, desperate for any sign of affection, any glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with, had readily agreed. A flicker of hope had ignited within her, a foolish, naive hope that this trip would be a new beginning for them. She packed her bags with a sense of cautious optimism, her heart a little lighter than it had been in years. She was a lamb being led to the slaughter, and she was blissfully unaware of the butcher's knife. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Julian met with Amelia one last time. They were in their usual hotel suite, the city lights twinkling below them like a carpet of fallen stars. But the mood was different this time. The air was charged with a tense, electric energy. The game was about to reach its final, terrifying conclusion. "Are you sure about this, Julian?" Amelia had asked, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. For the first time, a flicker of fear had appeared in her eyes. "There's no turning back from this." Julian had taken her face in his hands, his grip firm, almost painful. "There is no turning back," he had said, his voice a low, determined growl. "This is for us, Amelia, for our future, a future free from complications, a future where we can finally be together." He had kissed her then, a deep, bruising kiss that was more about possession than passion. It was a sealing of their unholy pact, a final commitment to the darkness they had chosen to embrace. As he drove back to his palatial home that night, a cold, hard knot of determination had settled in his stomach. There was no room for doubt, no space for remorse. He was a man on the brink of a new life, a life of unimaginable wealth and unrestrained freedom. And all that stood in his way was one last tragic act. He found Eleanor in their bedroom, a vision in a white silk nightgown. She was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens. She turned as he entered, a soft, hopeful smile on her face. "I'm so looking forward to our trip, Julian," she said, her voice a gentle melody. "It's been so long since we've had time for just the two of us." Julian walked towards her, his face a carefully constructed mask of love and affection. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. He could feel the gentle beat of her heart against his chest, a fragile, trusting rhythm that he was about to silence forever. "I know, my love," he whispered, his lips brushing against her hair. "It's going to be a trip we'll never forget." And as he held her in his arms, a chilling thought echoed in the silent chambers of his heart. "For you, my love, it will be the last trip you ever take." The air in the bayou was thick and heavy, a humid blanket woven with the smells of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet, cloying perfume of water hyacinths. The cypress trees, draped in ghostly veils of Spanish moss, stood like ancient sentinels, their gnarled roots submerged in the dark, murky water. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the water's surface like specters. It was a place of breathtaking, primeval beauty, a place where nature's raw and untamed power was on full display. It was also a place where secrets could be easily swallowed by the swamp, where the line between life and death was as thin and fluid as the water itself. Eleanor, however, saw only the beauty. She leaned back in the small, flat-bottomed boat, a genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The gentle lapping of the water against the hull, the chorus of bullfrogs tuning up for their nightly concert, the sight of a great blue heron taking flight in a graceful arc against the twilight sky, it was all so wonderfully, peacefully real. She felt a sense of liberation, a release from the suffocating opulence of her life in New Orleans. Here, in the heart of the wilderness, she could finally breathe. "Isn't it beautiful, Julian?" she asked, her voice filled with a childlike wonder. She reached out and squeezed his hand, her touch a silent expression of her gratitude. Julian, who was at the stern of the boat, expertly navigating them through the labyrinthine waterways, forced a smile. "It is," he said, his voice a little too tight, a little too strained. He was a coiled spring, a predator poised to strike. Every nerve in his body was screaming, every muscle tensed for the act he was about to commit. He looked at his wife, her face glowing in the soft, fading light, her eyes shining with a love and trust that he was about to betray in the most horrific way imaginable. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, a sliver of doubt pierced his cold, calculated resolve. But then he thought of Amelia, of her fiery passion, her sharp mind, her unwavering ambition. He thought of the $3 billion, a sum so vast it would make him a god among men. And the doubt was extinguished, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. This was not a murder. It was a necessary transaction, a culling of the weak to make way for the strong. He was not a monster. He was a pragmatist, a man willing to do what others were too afraid to even contemplate. He steered the boat towards a secluded cove, a place he had scouted out weeks before. It was a place where the water was deep and the current was slow, a place where the alligators, the true kings of the swamp, were known to congregate. He had even baited the area in the days leading up to their trip, tossing raw chickens into the water to ensure the presence of his unwitting accomplices. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional splash of a fish jumping out of the water. The air grew heavy with anticipation, the kind of charged silence that precedes a summer storm. "Why have we stopped?" Eleanor asked, a flicker of unease in her voice. The Aki was now a deep, inky black, and the swamp had taken on a more menacing aspect. The gnarled cypress trees looked like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab them, and the dark water seemed to be hiding a multitude of unseen horrors. Julian stood up, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the last vestiges of daylight. He walked towards the front of the boat, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat down next to Eleanor, his proximity both a comfort and a threat. "I wanted to show you something," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic whisper. He pointed towards the water, where a pair of red eyes glowed in the darkness. "The true heart of the bayou." Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. She could see the long, scaly snout of a large alligator just below the surface of the water. It was a creature of nightmares, a living relic from a prehistoric age. And it was terrifyingly close. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should go back. It's getting late." Julian wrapped an arm around her, his touch no longer a comfort but a restraint. "Don't be afraid, my love," he said, his voice a chillingly calm. "I'm right here with you." He leaned in close, as if to whisper a secret in her ear. His lips brushed against her skin, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he was going to kiss her. But then she felt his other hand on her back, a firm, unyielding pressure. And in that horrifying, heart-stopping instant, she finally saw the truth in his eyes. The love was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian emptiness that mirrored the eyes of the creature in the water. "Julian, no," she whispered, her voice a choked sob. But it was too late. With a sudden, brutal shove, he pushed her out of the boat. The cold, dark water was a shock to her system. She gasped, swallowing a mouthful of the foul-tasting swamp water. The heavy fabric of her dress weighed her down, pulling her under. She thrashed wildly, her arms and legs flailing in a desperate, primal struggle for survival. She clawed her way back to the surface, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. She saw the boat, a dark shape moving away from her. She saw Julian, a silent, impassive observer, watching her as she struggled. She screamed his name, a raw, guttural cry that was a mixture of terror, disbelief, and a desperate, fading hope that this was all just a terrible nightmare. But Julian didn't move. He just watched, his face a blank, emotionless mask. He was a spectator at his own gruesome creation, a god observing the final, agonizing moments of a life he had deemed insignificant. And then she felt it, a searing, unimaginable pain in her leg. It was a pain that transcended all other sensations, a pain that was both a crushing pressure and a razor-sharp tearing. She looked down and saw the long, dark snout of the alligator, its powerful jaws clamped around her leg. Her scream was no longer a plea for help. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. The alligator began to pull her under, its immense strength no match for her desperate struggles. The water closed over her head, and the world dissolved into a chaotic swirl of darkness, pain, and the terrifying primal roar of the beast that was dragging her down into its watery grave. Julian watched until the last of the bubbles had disappeared from the surface of the water. He waited for a few more minutes, the silence of the swamp now a testament to his horrific deed. He felt nothing, no remorse, no guilt, not even a flicker of sadness, only a cold, satisfying sense of accomplishment. The problem had been solved. The obstacle had been removed. He started the engine of the boat and calmly steered it back towards the small, rustic cabin he had rented for their romantic getaway. He moved with a chilling efficiency, his mind already working on the next phase of his plan. He had a story to tell, a performance to give. He had to be the grieving husband, the man whose world had been shattered by a tragic accident. He reached the cabin and immediately called the police. His voice was a masterpiece of controlled hysteria, his words tumbling out in a torrent of feigned grief and panic. He told them that his wife had fallen into the water, that he had tried to save her, but the current was too strong. He told them about the alligators, his voice breaking with a sob that he had practiced in his head 100 times. The police arrived, their boats cutting through the dark water, their flashlights slicing through the night. They listened to his story with a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. He was a convincing actor, and his performance was flawless. He was the picture of a man in shock, his clothes soaked, his face streaked with tears he had managed to summon on cue. The search for Eleanor's body began immediately, but it was a futile effort. The swamp did not give up its dead easily. The alligators, the currents, the dense vegetation, they were all part of a natural and highly efficient system of disposal. After a few days of fruitless searching, the official conclusion was reached. Eleanor Beaumont had tragically drowned, her body likely consumed by the swamp's apex predators. The news of Eleanor's death sent shockwaves through the elite circles of New Orleans. The society pages were filled with glowing eulogies, remembering her as a beacon of grace, beauty, and charity. Julian was inundated with messages of condolence, his home filled with a funereal parade of friends and family, all offering their support to the grieving widower. Julian played his part to perfection. He was a man broken by grief, a hollow shell of his former self. He wore black, he spoke in hushed tones, and his eyes were always red-rimmed, as if he had been weeping for days. He was a master of deception, and the world was his stage. He organized a lavish memorial service for Eleanor, a grand affair that was more of a coronation of his own grief than a tribute to his late wife. He delivered a moving eulogy, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of his love for Eleanor, of the light she had brought into his life, a light that had now been tragically extinguished. The mourners wept openly, their hearts breaking for the handsome, heartbroken man on the podium. They had no idea that they were weeping for a monster, a man who had orchestrated the very tragedy they were mourning. With the memorial service over, Julian turned his attention to the final, and most important, part of his plan, the insurance payout. He met with the insurance company's representatives, his face a mask of somber resignation. He presented them with the police report, the official death certificate, all the necessary paperwork. The insurance company, a massive, faceless corporation, was initially hesitant. A $3 billion payout was not something they took lightly. They launched their own investigation, sending a team of seasoned, cynical investigators to New Orleans to look into the matter. The investigators were a different breed from the local police. They were not swayed by Julian's charm or his performance of grief. They were men who dealt in facts, in probabilities, in the cold, hard calculus of risk. They interviewed Julian for hours, their questions sharp and probing. They went over his story again and again, looking for inconsistencies, for any crack in his carefully constructed facade. But Julian was prepared. He had rehearsed his story until it was second nature. He had an answer for every question, a plausible explanation for every detail. He was a rock, an unmovable object of feigned grief and unwavering consistency. The investigators also looked into Julian's finances, his business dealings, his personal life. They discovered the massive life insurance policy, a red flag that immediately raised their suspicions. They looked for a motive, for any reason why a man like Julian Beaumont would want his wife dead. And they found Amelia. They discovered the affair through a series of anonymous tips and a deep dive into Julian's credit card records. The secret hotel rooms, the expensive gifts, the clandestine trips, it all painted a picture of a man who was leading a double life. The investigators confronted Julian with their findings. They laid out the evidence of his affair, the timing of the increased life insurance policy, the suspicious circumstances of Eleanor's death. They were sure they had him. They were sure he would crack. But Julian didn't crack. He didn't even flinch. He looked the investigators in the eye, his expression a mixture of righteous indignation and wounded pride. "Yes, I had an affair," he admitted, his voice a low, steady confession. "I am not proud of it. I betrayed my wife's trust, and I will have to live with that for the rest of my life. But that does not make me a murderer." He then proceeded to spin a new narrative, a story of a man who had made a terrible mistake, a man who was trying to end his affair and recommit to his wife. The trip to the bayou, he explained, was his attempt to save his marriage, a last, desperate act of a man who had realized the error of his ways. It was a brilliant performance, a masterclass in manipulation. He turned their evidence against them, using his affair not as a motive for murder, but as a reason for his desperate attempt at reconciliation. He was not a cold-blooded killer. He was a flawed, repentant husband who had been robbed of his chance at redemption by a tragic accident. The investigators were left with a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but no smoking gun. They had a strong suspicion, a gut feeling that Julian was guilty, but they had no concrete proof. They couldn't prove that he had pushed Eleanor out of the boat. They couldn't prove that her death was anything other than a tragic accident. With no body and no confession, their hands were tied. The insurance company, faced with the prospect of a long, expensive, and potentially losing legal battle, made a business decision. They paid out the claim. $3 billion. The money was transferred into Julian's account, a string of zeros that represented the culmination of his monstrous plan. He had done it. He had committed the perfect crime. He called Amelia, his voice a triumphant whisper. "It's done," he said. "We're free." A few months later, after a respectable period of mourning, Amelia moved into the Beaumont estate. She was no longer the secret mistress, hiding in the shadows. She was the new lady of the manor, the queen of Julian's newly acquired kingdom. She wore Eleanor's clothes. She dripped in Eleanor's jewels. She slept in Eleanor's bed. She hosted lavish parties, her laughter echoing through the grand halls that had once been filled with Eleanor's quiet grace. She was the serpent in the garden, and she had finally claimed her prize. Julian, with his vast fortune and his beautiful, ambitious new partner, was on top of the world. He was a man who had everything he had ever wanted. He was powerful, he was wealthy, he was untouchable. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house was quiet and the ghosts of his past were free to roam, he would wake up in a cold sweat. He would hear the faint echo of a scream, the sound of a desperate plea carried on the humid Louisiana air. He would see a pair of trusting blue eyes, their light extinguished by a horrifying betrayal. He would tell himself it was just a dream, a trick of his overactive imagination. He had committed the perfect crime, and he had gotten away with it. He was a king, and kings were not haunted by the ghosts of their past. But the swamp had a long memory, and its secrets, buried deep in the dark, murky water, were not meant to stay hidden forever. The new life Julian and Amelia had built upon the foundations of Eleanor's grave was a whirlwind of extravagant indulgence. They traveled the world on a whim, their private jet a silver bullet streaking across continents. They bought a sprawling villa on the Amalfi Coast, a chic penthouse in Paris, and a private island in the Caribbean. They drank vintage champagne like it was water and adorned themselves with jewels that could have funded a small nation. The Beaumont estate in New Orleans was transformed from a place of quiet, old-world elegance into a stage for their ostentatious displays of wealth. The parties were legendary, bacchanalian affairs that lasted for days, the grounds teeming with the rich, the famous, and the morally bankrupt. Amelia, once the ambitious upstart, now reigned as the undisputed queen of New Orleans society. She was a dazzling, formidable presence, her sharp wit and ruthless charm a perfect match for Julian's cold ambition. She had everything she had ever dreamed of: wealth beyond measure, a man who worshipped her, and the power to shape her world as she saw fit. She had erased Eleanor from the narrative, stepping so completely into her shoes that it was as if the former Mrs. Beaumont had never existed. The staff who had once served Eleanor now answered to Amelia. The friends who had once mourned with Julian now toasted to his new happiness. The past, it seemed, had been successfully buried. Julian, for his part, was a man reborn. The nagging whispers of his conscience, the fleeting images of Eleanor's final moments, had been silenced by the deafening roar of his success. He was a titan of industry, his $3 billion windfall a war chest that he used to expand his empire with breathtaking speed and ruthlessness. He was a predator in the boardroom, his takeovers as swift and brutal as the alligator that had served as his accomplice. He was admired, feared, and envied in equal measure. He had cheated death, or rather, he had orchestrated it, and had emerged not only unscathed but infinitely more powerful. He was a testament to the idea that in the game of life, the rules were for the weak, and victory belonged to the bold. But a ghost had followed them from the bayou, a silent, patient specter that was slowly but surely beginning to unravel the silken tapestry of their perfect life. That ghost was Detective Frank Dubois, a grizzled, rumpled veteran of the New Orleans Police Department. He was a man who had seen too much of the city's dark underbelly to be fooled by a pretty face and a convincing story. He was a bloodhound, and the scent of Julian Beaumont's guilt was a stench he couldn't get out of his nostrils. Dubois had been one of the first officers on the scene the night Eleanor had disappeared. He had listened to Julian's story, had seen the perfectly feigned grief, and from that very first moment, his gut had screamed that something was wrong. It was all too neat, too perfect. The grieving husband, the tragic accident, the convenient presence of alligators, it was a story that felt like it had been written, rehearsed, and performed. He had been overruled by his superiors, who were eager to close the case on a high-profile family like the Beaumonts. The official verdict was accidental death, case closed. But for Du Bois, the case had never been closed. It was a splinter in his mind, a puzzle with a missing piece that he was determined to find. He had spent his own time, off the clock, digging into the Beaumonts' lives. He had been the one to uncover the affair with Amelia, the one who had anonymously tipped off the insurance investigators. He had watched with a grim, cynical satisfaction as they had put the screws to Julian, and had been bitterly disappointed when the insurance company had paid out. But he hadn't given up. He began to shadow Julian and Amelia, a persistent, unwelcome presence on the periphery of their glittering world. He would sit in his unmarked car for hours outside their estate, watching the endless parade of luxury cars and beautiful people. He would tail them to their exclusive restaurants and private clubs, his rumpled suit and weary eyes a stark contrast to their polished perfection. He became a running joke among their friends, the sad little detective who couldn't let go. But Du Bois was not just watching, he was waiting. He knew that people like Julian and Amelia, people who believed they were above the consequences, eventually made mistakes. Their arrogance was their Achilles heel, and he was patient enough to wait for it to trip them up. The first crack in their facade came from an unlikely source, an old, grizzled Cajun fisherman named Jacques Boudreau. Jacques was a man of the swamp, born and raised in the bayou. He knew its secrets, its rhythms, its hidden dangers. He had been out on the water the night Eleanor had died, checking his crawfish traps in a remote part of the swamp not far from where Julian had taken his wife. He had heard a scream that night, a woman's scream, a sound of pure terror that had cut through the humid night air. It was a sound that had chilled him to the bone. He had also seen the light from a boat, had heard the sound of its engine as it had sped away. At the time, he had dismissed it. The swamp was a wild place, and strange things happened in the dead of night. But the memory of that scream had haunted him. Du Bois, in his relentless, methodical investigation, had been interviewing everyone who lived and worked in the area around the Beaumont's Bayou property. He had tracked down Jacques, and had listened to his story with a growing sense of excitement. It was the first piece of evidence that contradicted Julian's version of events. Julian had claimed to have stayed in the area after Eleanor had fallen in, desperately searching for her. Jacques' story suggested that the boat had fled the scene immediately after the scream. Armed with this new information, Du Bois managed to convince a sympathetic judge to grant him a warrant to search the Beaumont estate. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. The search was a massive undertaking. A team of forensics experts descended upon the pristine mansion, their clinical, methodical work a violation of the carefully curated perfection of Julian and Amelia's world. They combed through every room, every closet, every drawer. They took samples from the carpets, the upholstery, the drains. Julian and Amelia watched the proceedings with a mixture of amusement and contempt. They were untouchable, and this was just a desperate, pathetic attempt by a washed-up detective to make a name for himself. "Let him look," Julian had said to Amelia, a confident smirk on his face. "He won't find anything." But he was wrong. In the back of a rarely used closet in the guest wing, tucked away in a dusty old hatbox, a forensic technician found a small, mud-stained evening bag. Inside the bag was a water-damaged cell phone. It was Eleanor's. The phone was a relic from a life that had been brutally extinguished. It was a ghost in the machine, a voice from beyond the grave. The tech team at the police department worked for weeks to recover the data from the water-damaged phone. It was a painstaking process, but they finally succeeded. And what they found was a bombshell. The phone contained a series of text messages, sent by Eleanor to her sister in the days leading up to her death. In the messages, Eleanor had expressed her growing fear of Julian. She had written about his controlling behavior, his violent temper, his increasingly erratic moods. She had written that she was afraid he was going to hurt her. And then there was the final message, sent on the very day she had died. It was a message that had never been sent, a draft that was still saved on the phone. It read, "He's taking me to the bayou. He says it's a romantic getaway, but I'm scared. If something happens to me, don't let him get away with it." It was the voice of a dead woman, a desperate, prophetic warning that had finally been heard. It was the smoking gun that Du Bois had been searching for. But there was more. The forensics team had also been analyzing the data from Julian's car. They found that, on the day of Eleanor's death, Julian had not driven directly to the bayou as he had claimed. He had made a stop at a remote, industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city. A warehouse that was owned by one of his shell corporations. Du Bois and his team raided the warehouse. Inside, they found a large walk-in freezer. And in the freezer, they found traces of blood. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Eleanor Beaumont. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Julian hadn't just pushed his wife into a crocodile-infested swamp. He had planned it with a chilling, meticulous precision. He had likely drugged her at the warehouse, then transported her to the bayou, where he had staged the accident. The evening bag and the phone had been a mistake, a small, overlooked detail in an otherwise perfect crime. Armed with this new, damning evidence, Du Bois arrested Julian Beaumont for the murder of his wife. The arrest was a media sensation. The golden couple's perfect world came crashing down in a maelstrom of flashing cameras and screaming headlines. Amelia was also arrested, charged as an accomplice to murder. The investigators had found a series of incriminating emails between her and Julian, emails in which they had discussed the Eleanor problem and their plans for a future together. The trial was the spectacle of the decade. It was a sordid, sensational story of greed, lust, and cold-blooded murder. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, socialites, and a public that was both horrified and fascinated by the tale of the beautiful heiress and her monstrous husband. Julian, ever the master manipulator, tried to charm the jury. He took the stand in his own defense, his voice a smooth, convincing baritone as he painted himself as the victim, a man who had been framed by a vengeful detective and a gold-digging mistress. But his charm had finally run out. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The text messages from Eleanor's phone, the blood in the warehouse, the testimony of the Cajun fisherman. It was a mountain of guilt that he could not explain away. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, his face a mask of grim disgust, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amelia, in a desperate attempt to save herself, had turned against Julian. She had agreed to testify against him in exchange for a lesser charge. Her testimony had been a chilling, detailed account of their affair, of their cold-blooded plan to murder Eleanor for the insurance money. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As Julian was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his handsome face was no longer a mask of confidence and control. It was the face of a man who had lost everything, a king who had been dethroned. He caught the eye of Detective Du Bois, who was standing at the back of the courtroom. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, Julian's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. He was no longer a god, a titan, a conqueror. He was just a small, pathetic man, a murderer who had been brought to justice by the ghost of the woman he had so ruthlessly discarded. The Beaumont estate was sold, its contents auctioned off to the highest bidder. The $3 billion fortune was seized by the state, the ill-gotten gains of a monstrous crime. The gilded cage was finally empty, its secrets laid bare for the world to see. And in the heart of the Louisiana bayou, the swamp kept its own counsel. The alligators still glided through the dark, murky water, their ancient eyes holding the secrets of 1,000 moonless nights. They were the silent, unknowing witnesses to a tale of human greed and monstrous cruelty. And they were the eternal guardians of Eleanor's watery grave, a place where a ghost's desperate plea had finally been answered, a place where justice, like the slow, patient current of the bayou, had finally found its way.